The Blitz wrought wholesale destruction across the length and breadth of Britain. Great areas lay devastated, reduced to smoking ruins.
The bombing put civilians firmly in the firing line. For those who lived through it, the experience was utterly terrifying. Now it was Liverpool's turn to be the primary target of the Luftwaffe's brutal campaign. Bombing raids had already targeted the city centre, the docks, and residential areas.
At Mill Road Hospital, Dr. Leonard Findlay and his deputy matron Gertrude Royden were dealing with the dozens of wounded now flooding in. The hospital was one of the few near the docks still open. For those inside, the bombs sounded far too close for comfort.
The wards at Mill Road Hospital would have been full to capacity. There would have been many casualties from the previous 2 nights' raids. The 2 most senior members of staff in charge of running the hospital, matron Gertrude Royden and the hospital superintendent, Dr. Leonard Findlay, were now trying to work out a better plan for dealing with the incoming injured.
Charles Findlay is Dr. Findlay's son.
I would describe my father as a totally devoted physician. He was also a perfectionist.
Dr. Findlay had been in charge of preparing the hospital for war. He knew just how vulnerable it was. He'd already witnessed for himself the destructive power of aerial bombardment.
In the previous November, he was very much involved in administering to the injured and trapped in an incident where a building collapsed onto an air raid shelter and about 170 people were trapped inside that shelter. Many of them died very horribly, and he had to crawl through the wreckage administering morphia to people, which is all he said he could do that time.
Dr. Findlay worried about his hospital's proximity to the docks. Other nearby hospitals had closed their doors, but Mill Road had no choice but to stay open.
Mill Road had a role as a wartime casualty hospital, but it was still functioning as a normal hospital. There was outpatients, a maternity wing, a normal general hospital, but then it also had the added pressure of having to deal with the casualties during the bombing raids.
The maternity ward was a particular headache. There were concerns for the women's safety, but heavily pregnant women presented a very specific set of problems.
Earlier that night, it had been decided to move patients to the basement, but some pregnant women and mothers with babies couldn't make it down the stairs. The only protection offered to them had been to move their beds away from the walls.
Now, with bombs falling, Dr. Findlay and matron Royden focused on the stream of injured people who were arriving at the hospital.
My father, the matron, and my father's deputy were working in the outpatients department, dealing with new casualties. At that stage, it would have been running reasonably smoothly.
As they were busy processing the influx of casualties, Mill Road was hit. Dr. Findlay and matron Royden were standing in the centre of the hospital, right in the heart of the explosion.
The hospital was struck by a parachute mine. It was a direct hit. The explosion ripped through the wards, operating theatres and surrounding buildings.
2 miles from the docks at Mill Road Hospital, a parachute mine had scored a direct hit. Somehow, Dr. Leonard Findlay, the hospital superintendent, and his colleague matron Gertrude Royden had survived. But as the dust began to settle, they discovered the maternity ward, full of expectant mothers and women with their newborn babies, had been destroyed.
It was night time. There were fires starting. There were probably people screaming out for help. Everybody running everywhere trying to work out what on earth they should be doing. So it was the stuff of nightmares.
For the mothers and their babies who'd been on the ward as the bomb struck, it must have been terrifying.
I have an account here written by a Mrs. Spencer, one of the mothers caught up in the events on that dreadful night. My baby started to cry, so I turned myself to the wall to feed her. Then this big woof came. I thought my ears had burst as the dust and glass came showering down. It was obvious we had been hit. The room was lit up by the fire above. The floor was littered by glass.
Earlier that night, Dr. Findlay had tried to move as many of the mothers down to the relative safety of the basement as he could. But not everyone could be moved. Whether they ran out of space or ran out of time, many mothers remained on the ward. Among those left behind was Elsie Haunch, who had given birth just days before to her baby, Joyce. They were in the maternity ward when the bomb hit.
I was born on the 26th of April.
Joyce is now in her 70s and recalls the tragedy of that night.
A lot of the mums and babies didn't survive. They were on the wrong side of the corridor. And that must have been dreadful for everybody else, mustn't it?
In the aftermath of the explosion, Joyce's mother, Elsie, only had one thing on her mind: to get out as fast as possible.
But Mum just picked me up and she ran as fast as she could. With the hospital falling down behind her, negotiating all sorts of debris. My mum and dad never ever spoke about the war. I think they were just so distraught. They just never ever wanted to talk about it. We were very fortunate. You can get upset about it, can't you, really?
There's no way of knowing the exact number of women who got caught up in the carnage of the maternity ward. We do know that at least 8 mothers and their newborn babies were killed.
A lot of mothers were killed, a lot of babies were killed, a lot of them were newborn babies. And that must have been a nightmare for all of them. Those that escaped managed to do so a lot of the time just helping themselves, scrambling out of the wreckage the best they could, and hopefully finding their babies, or otherwise searching desperately for them.
It was a terrible situation for Dr. Findlay and Matron Royden. There were people still buried in the rubble.
The call went out across the city for all available rescue, first aid and ambulance help. To add to the chaos, Mill Road's own ambulance depot had been destroyed, making it harder to move victims to other hospitals. Meanwhile, casualties continued to pour in from the surrounding area.
By 2 in the morning, help had begun to arrive. Several trucks packed with soldiers joined in the rescue effort, digging victims out of the rubble.
The rescue were carried on throughout the night because this bombing raid went on for 6 hours, you know, and the initial bomb had hit quite early on. So if you can imagine, all the rescue work is going on while bombs are still coming around them. So it must have been a terrifying ordeal that the people were going through at that time, trying to fight the fires, recover the bodies, rescue people who they could still hear within the rubble.
It was a long and grueling night, and despite their injuries, Gertrude and Dr. Findlay worked through it, tending to casualties. At some point, Gertrude's wounded eye made it impossible for her to carry on, and she was taken to another hospital.
My father, despite his horrible injuries, stayed on duty for something like 36 hours. He would spend the whole time organising all sorts of aspects of rescue, recovery, etc., and trying to create some order out of the complete initial chaos.
They were digging people out of the rubble for hours. They rescued around 400. But 97 people lost their lives that night.